Hello my friends, and thank you so much for joining me. The video that you're about to watch is a recording of a series of classes that I delivered on Buddhist philosophy during my time in the Shaolin Warrior Monk program. The recording has been edited for the sake of brevity and the enjoyment of an online audience. So with that out of the way, please relax and enjoy the video.
Thank you all for coming and thank you for being on time. Today the class is on the Four Noble Truths Part 1. So I'm going to cover off the first three. The fourth one will be on Wednesday. For those that were here last week, so far we have talked about emptiness, the nature of reality and the nature of things, the idea that things lack intrinsic self-nature. We talked about non-self, which is the idea that the self is an illusion, much the same as everything else. We are emptiness. We talked about dependent origination, which is the idea that everything is connected and the causes and conditions affect everything. And we also talked about karma, which is kind of how your actions are connected to everything else. And we talked about the definition of karma, which is action. So therefore, every action is karmic. And so everything you do affects your karma. So the reason that I chose to cover that off is because that's kind of a lot of like the theory that's part of Buddhism, some of the more philosophical or metaphysical aspects of it. Today, I want to talk about what the Buddha actually taught. I think the Buddha would have been a very practical man, probably not a theoretical philosopher, more so a teacher. So I'm going to start the class off with a little bit of history about who the Buddha was, since we haven't actually talked about that yet. So the Buddha was born Siddhartha Gautama. He was a prince. He was born in the 6th century BCE, so about 500 years before Jesus Christ. He was born in a place called Lumbini, which is kind of on the border between India and Nepal, northern India, Nepal. And he was born into luxury. So he had a palace and he was very shielded from a lot of the realities and hardship of the world. At 29, feeling dissatisfied with his comfortable life, he decided to leave the palace and venture forth into the world. On his journeys, he encounters an old man, and then he encounters a sick person, and then he encounters a corpse on the side of the road, and finally he encounters an ascetic. Does everybody know what that word means, ascetic? So ascetic is, you might have seen the Indian rishis who are very, very thin, like gaunt thin, and they have no possessions and they have maybe like a cloth. They don't even have a name. So asceticism is basically the practice of giving up your worldly possessions and renouncing yourself, essentially. So you deny all of your kind of worldly desires and you live a very simple life. So ascetics will often fast. They will take food in an alms bowl. So in India, it wouldn't be uncommon for an ascetic to come up to you. And it's not begging because in the culture, it's seen as a karmic action to offer food to an ascetic. So this individual can cultivate themselves. So typically very skinny, very simple people. They live a very simple life. So the Buddha meets one of these ascetics who teaches him a little bit about his philosophy. Because he was disturbed by meeting the old person, the sick person, and the corpse, this was the first time the Buddha had ever really seen sick people and old people. So he becomes very upset with the suffering of the world. And so he sets about alleviating that suffering and trying to learn how to overcome suffering. So after meeting the ascetic, he decides to try out those methods. He engages in rigorous fasting. At the time, one of the main religious sects was called the Jains, who were known for hardcore like meditation, fasting. I've even heard stories of sitting out, you imagine like the hot Indian summer, near a fire, so you're like sweltering hot in an attempt to burn off your karma, because karma is action. So if the ascetic is able to stay still, not eat any food, and literally kind of melt away, if you recall the class where we talked about the spirits of light who were able to float and still they started eating and gorging themselves, and then they became sticky and heavy. So the ascetics kind of trying to reverse that and to burn off the body. So the Buddha tries this for a while, and he becomes emaciated, extremely thin and weak, and he can barely function, he can barely practice. And he thinks to himself, I'm not able to cultivate myself when I'm this weak and when I'm this gaunt and starved. So he rejects this idea. This is too extreme, and the body is not able to function. And bear in mind, he came from a life of luxury, so he's kind of gone to both extremes, like extreme wealth and comfort. And I understand he had a wife and children, so he's had all the niceties of life, and then he's also gone the opposite direction and given up everything. And he says, you know what, these are too extreme. And so he kind of brings it into the middle, which is why it's called the middle way. If you don't know, now you know that Buddhism is often called the middle way because it's between those two extremes, a life of luxury, or what we might call today materialism, and then a life of complete renunciation and complete, I guess we would call it minimalism, but it's more than that. It's almost like anorexia, actually. It's about really, really burning off everything. So, following this, at 35 years old, he achieves enlightenment after meditating under the Bodhi tree, at which point he becomes the Buddha, which means the enlightened one. Before that, he was Siddhartha Gautama. So you hear that. That's his name, his birth name. Buddha was a title. And I guess that's kind of his fundamental concern, is this suffering of life. So if you're starving all the time and you're, not eating and you're burning up in the sun and you have nothing, you're also suffering. And then, of course, the pleasure leads to suffering. So I remember, he basically was like, I'm not going to be able to cultivate and overcome suffering if I'm weak and I can't move and stuff. That was at 35. So, so often in the 30s. Yeah, but I find it very interesting how religious figures often achieve their kind of peak in their 30s. Just personally interesting to me. Anyhow, through his enlightenment, he gains insight into the nature of suffering and its causes and how to overcome that suffering, which he summarizes into the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths tend to pop up in most forms of Buddhism. You've got lots of different sects, so they're fairly fundamental to the overall teachings of Buddhism. So, with that kind of out of the way, we are going to talk about those truths, starting off with number one, which is pronounced Dukkha. So Dukkha gets translated often as suffering, but this is not quite right. So if you look into kind of like the etymology of the word, du means like bad or off, or you know how at the start of a word you'll have ill, like ill will or illness. So it just means like the opposite of good. And then ka, I understand, means like a hole or a slot that an axle would go through for a cart. So if you have a bad connection of an axle, the cart will be unsteady and it won't travel true. So it's uncomfortable. So the translation most commonly used is suffering. I think a better translation is like unease or discomfort, or sometimes just I think of it as just offness. It's just not quite satisfying, right? It has broad connotations. And I think when you start to think about the nature of suffering as the Buddha saw it, you can see why it's such a hard word to precisely define. So I prefer to just use the word dukkha because it means what it means, and then we can try to put an English word on it. So dukkha, it means that something is just not quite right, or that something is just not quite satisfying. And the Buddha says this is literally the nature of life. It's a fundamental truth that characterizes life itself. So I know this is actually like kind of a controversial statement, actually. You hear this a lot, the Buddhists say life is suffering, and you're like, oh yeah, what a pessimistic worldview, right? Like I'm not suffering when I have my favorite food or when I'm enjoying my favorite TV show. It's kind of a dramatic statement. I was just kind of curious, like who immediately disagrees with the statement life is suffering? You just raise your hand if you like. Fair enough. And what about the statement like life is unsatisfying? Does that change it a little bit? Right. Yeah, I like that you bring up the hunger one because you're kind of getting closer to the sort of fundamental, like what the Buddha is really saying about life, the nature of life forms. So I'll kind of leave that there. Dukkha, offness, unease. Life is like this. The truth of suffering. So that's number one. Samudaya, the truth of the cause of the suffering. So this word, samudaya, I understand it means arising. But what arises? So what is this thing that is actually causing this dissatisfaction? So the words that I've got here are craving and aversion and attachment and discrimination. So what do I mean by that? So if you think about like a life form as opposed to a non-life form, a life form tends to grow, which means that it has metabolism and it has needs. So even plants and animals, they're always looking for something, right? Like a plant needs sunlight, it needs fertile soil. A mouse is always looking for insects to eat or rubbish, or, it can never really just be done. The mission is never accomplished. The nature of life is to continually move forward. And if we ignore that, we would essentially be ignoring the will to live, right? Because we would eventually get hungry, or we would get tired, or we would need to go to the bathroom. If you were to just stop and do nothing, how long do you think you would last? And I mean this in a very literal way. If you just stopped moving, doing anything, how long would you be okay for?
3 days.
Me? You reckon 3 days?
Yeah, because you would be drinking and you die.
Yeah, but would you be okay with those 3 days? My question is even more literal than that. If I just sit here and do nothing, how long will I last before I get uncomfortable, uneasy, suffering? Yeah, but I probably need to piss after about an hour or two. It's annoying. It's like as soon as you hold still, you're just like, oh, I've got to do something. That's what he's talking about. So it's not this profound suffering of oh, I'm having this midlife crisis, or I don't know the meaning. It's literally that life's just kind of annoying. You need to do stuff. You need to move. You need to be doing your next thing. Why am I waking up today? Oh, I've got to go clean my teeth. Got to go to the bathroom. So it's unsatisfying because it's the will to live. It's this word will. Write it down. We have will. So a rock, it has no will. It does nothing. If a rock will stay there for 1,000 years and it won't complain, it won't bother. It has no will. But an animal or a life form, or even a tree, it can't stay stationary. In the rainforest, the trees are actually really ruthless with one another. If a big, large tree falls over and suddenly there's free real estate, which it means sunlight, the tree has a growth spurt. All the trees that are in the shade will suddenly shoot up, and the first one to get it will shade out the other ones and kill them. So trees are actually really competitive with one another. This fight for survival is built into the nature of life. And so we humans are oh, I'm not competitive. It's yes, you are. Your very nature is born of competition. Without competition, you wouldn't be here, right? So it's if you look at any other forms of life, competition is very, very obvious. So this is the nature of life, because nature is always moving. It's always growing. Call this the will to live, and everything has the will to live. If you lack the will to live, might be something like depression. People who are depressed often do spend all day in bed, right? And we kind of consider this to be a mental illness, but it's kind of they don't have a will to do anything. They actually just kind of stop. And that's also a state of suffering. So it's kind of hard to escape. If you're a healthy and active person, you get up and you do your daily activities, but if you don't do them, it's like an itch, and you need to scratch that itch. And so this is kind of dukkha. So I've written here craving and aversion. So Daniel, in your example, when you wake up in the morning, it would be that you're waking up and then you're I got to go do something. That's a craving, right? That's a desire. So that arises within you through the mind. Likewise, you could wake up and it could be oh, today I have to do power training, and you're oh, I don't want to do it. This is the feeling of aversion. So you're dreading something, or you're you can either really want something or you can not want something. You get what I mean? There's always that sort of dichotomy. And then what kind of happens is you arise discrimination. I want the good things and I don't want the bad things. So I don't want to eat the boring food and I want binchilin, this is discrimination. This also causes suffering. And when we create these kinds of discrimination patterns in our mind, we become attached, right? So it'll be interesting. We might be moving schools, and I'm just noticing in my mind how I'm oh, I'm quite settled here. I like my bed, I like my routines, I like my habits. I've become a little bit attached to the place, actually. And I'm thinking oh, what if there's not good water, or what if I don't have a good bed, or what if do you know what I mean? This is something I've thought about. So this is attachment. This is also associated with a form of ignorance. we tend to think that things will satisfy us even though they won't. So we like, sugar is a really easy example, right? Because it's like very delicious. It's just that like the more you have it, the more you crave it. So it actually like creates more desire by consuming it. Instead, we kind of think it does the opposite. In KFC, I don't know if this is like around the world, but its slogan in New Zealand is like satisfy your craving. And the irony is like if you have KFC, it's not going to satisfy your craving. It's going to create a craving. So we have this kind of like delusion about how we can satisfy ourselves when actually all we're doing is like dissatisfying ourselves. It's really like, it's a crazy paradox. All of this craving, we're basically seeking pleasure, we're avoiding pain, and it leads to discrimination, and this is why we suffer, according to the Buddha. I want to mention here that pain and pleasure themselves are not the problem. Like dukkha does not mean pain. It's not that like life is pain, which maybe when I say suffering, people think, oh, life is not pain. There's so much goodness in life. But if there's good, you're going to get attached to it. So the problem is not pain and pleasure. It's attachment to pleasure and aversion of pain. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yes. There's nothing to fear but fear itself, right? Like the pain itself is just something you go through. It's all the shit in your head. Like, oh, it's going to hurt. Oh, I'm afraid. Oh, like I just can't wait for this to be over. It's all this mental complaining. That's the suffering, right? According to the Buddha. Pain and pleasure are unavoidable, by the way. It's just like that is literally unavoidable. You will experience pain and you will experience pleasure. That's just kind of baked into your brain. So for most people, we have preferences. And when we don't get those preferences met, it's just kind of a bummer. And I don't know anybody that's like above this. Everybody seems to like things and dislike other things. And it's why, you've got to be so careful about expectations. Like you guys remember when we were in Jizza, the bus, and we were just so like, oh, it's so small because we were expecting a bigger one. And it's like, it was actually fine. Like that bus ride, I was fine. I was just as comfortable as the bus ride there. But I think my expectations were different, so you know what I mean? So it's like your mind, like your expectations is what's creating this. So yeah, the cause of this dissatisfaction is craving and avoiding things. Let's put it that way. When you crave things and you want to avoid things, this gives rise to discrimination. It's like, I want that and I don't want that. That also causes dissatisfaction because you're never going to get your own way. Yeah. You get attached to the things that you like and you just want to avoid the things you don't like. And so I'm like, sometimes the food, right? Some people don't like it and some people love it. And actually both can lead to suffering. Like if you really love something, it's like when you don't get it, you're disappointed. And if you really hate something, when you get it, you're disappointed. So either way kind of leads to the same conclusion. So the third noble truth, the truth of the cessation of suffering. This word is Nirodha. Nirodha is Sanskrit. It means cessation. But it's not the way that the suffering can be stopped. It's just that the suffering can be stopped. It makes sense? Mm-hmm. So these like four noble truths are like pretty, like they almost like make up a sentence when you combine them together, but by themselves they're not even really a sentence. The fourth noble truth is how you stop it. The third noble truth is that it can be stopped. So yeah, the basic claim is that the dissatisfaction of life can be ceased. You can be content. You don't have to be craving. You don't have to be avoiding things. Contentment, or equanimity. You hear this a lot in Buddhism, but it's basically the feeling of ease, of peace. So according to the Buddha, and this is true in yoga as well, I really, really like the similarity here. The source of this arising is the mind. That's citta. So all of these cravings and aversions, they pop into your mind. It's a thought, really. Actually, that's what it is. So the mental activity associated with craving can be stopped. You can kind of train yourself out of this mental complaining or mentally craving things. Yoga, I'm just going to do a quick plug here. Basically, it says the exact same thing. And I think it's really fun to know. Who's heard of the Yoga Sutras? Yes. So the Yoga Sutra is kind of the most well-known handbook on the practice of yoga. It's written by a man named Patanjali. And Patanjali and the Buddha may have lived around pretty similar times to one another. They don't know exactly, maybe within a couple hundred years of each other. So they were definitely feeding off of the same ideas. So in yoga, you get this. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. I think it's Yoga Sutra number 2. of the Yoga Sutras. What it means is yoga. Yoga is, this means the mind or the mind field, the activity of the mind, and then cessation. So yoga is about the cessation of the mental activity that gives rise to this suffering. So they actually have the exact same goal. Like they're very, very similar. People don't realize how similar they really are. They're kind of like siblings. They have common ancestral roots in the Indian philosophical tradition. So recall that dukkha arises in the mind and it causes us to crave pleasure and avoid pain and discriminate between the two. And if we can train our mind, then we can actually overcome this suffering. So the fourth truth is the technique to overcome the suffering, which is why I've saved it to its own class, because it's an entire practice. It's called the Eightfold Path. The fourth noble truth is often called like the path. So we'll talk about that in detail. It also gives rise to like an ethical framework and a lot of actions that you have to do, and explains meditation a little bit more. So I'm going to leave the kind of teaching there, and we're just going to have a bit more discussion amongst ourselves. So the questions that I want you to talk about is this picture of life. How is this different from the Western worldview? Don't actually need to be the Western worldview, but let's say like a non-Buddhist worldview. Question for you personally, do you find life dissatisfying in the way that we've now discussed, and that you're always kind of looking for something or you're always dreading something? And then last question, when you think about your life and your culture that you've grown up in, is craving discouraged or is it encouraged? I just want to wrap this up. A couple of thoughts. I'm glad that this has got you thinking. The Western culture, as far as I can observe, some of the people that I really look up to, like Arnold Schwarzenegger and The Rock, they have this mindset of like, how badly do you want it? And I just like the phrasing of that statement is amazing to me now. Like, how badly do you want it? So it's almost like saying that, like, I want it so bad, it hurts me. You know what I mean? It's like, I feel like this is very encouraged in the West, that you should be very, very driven to what you desire, and that you should never give up, and you should be willing to do whatever it takes. And I think you can find a degree of satisfaction in that grind, in that process. So it is an alternative worldview in that respect. I think also the American dream is defined as the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit meaning like that you haven't attained it yet. And then you have to question, what does America define as happiness? It generally defines it as external wealth and material objects. And until you have that, you're kind of like dissatisfied. It's like, sucks to be poor, you know, sucks to be working and not having those things that you want. So I just find it really, really interesting that like as you say, it's been very productive and it's like built these empires. But on the other hand, like it basically profits off of people being dissatisfied with their life. Another example, when you watch television, I used to watch television, the way that like they would sell products would be like, are you tired of blackheads? Are you tired of grey hairs? Are you tired of feeling like lousy all the time? Like it always like evokes this feeling in you of like, yeah, that sucks. I hate that. You know, like there'll be an ad for like a multivitamin. It's just like, are you not feeling your best? And it's like, who's feeling their absolute best? Like even here when I'm training and being super healthy, am I my best? It's like something like that can get to you, and then you suddenly want something. And this is how our entire like the economy has basically functioned, by creating desire in people and then making them think that they needed that. And just between us, I think the whole thing has been lying. But anyways, if anybody else would like to share something, I'm happy to keep chatting after class, but I think we should leave it there and go back and rest. Thank you very much for coming, guys.